Hello and welcome. My name is Clare O'Brien, and I'm a research assistant with Security and Context. I am joined today by Haidar Reda, who is based in Romania and received his PhD at the Graduate School of Humanities and Social Science at Chiba University in Japan in 2021. Thank you, Haidar, for taking the time to discuss your research with us. And if you don't mind, please tell us more about your background and your research interests.
Thank you very much for hosting me, and thank you very much for the introduction. So my name is Haidar, and originally I'm from Iraq. And my background, actually, I did my BA in political science from Baghdad University, Iraq. And then after I graduated, I moved to India, where I did my master degree in political science. And after that, I got scholarship to the US, Hartford Seminary, where I studied interfaith dialogue for 1 year. And after that, in 2013, I went back to Iraq and I worked at Karbala University, where I worked as a researcher and lecturer. In 2015, I received full scholarship to Japan. So I studied at Tokyo University of Foreign Studies as a research student for 2 years. In 2017, I joined Chiba University and I did my PhD in political science in March 2021. I graduated from Japan. So because of the Corona situation, we moved to Romania. And as for my area of interest is sectarian relation and tribal societies in modern Iraq. So as you know, many scholars know that, particularly scholars on Iraqi studies, sectarianism considered as a taboo topic among the people of Iraq. And usually they ignore the existence of sectarian conflicts. So during my field research in Iraq in 2017, 2018, I noticed that many Shia, for example, tend to point the finger at Wahhabis and Saudi Arabia for the attacks against them. Likewise, Sunni accuse Iran and Shu'ubis for the violence they most endure. These findings strike me as more than coincidental. I turned my attention to discourses of the political leaders in Iraq in modern and contemporary history, and hope of better understanding of sectarianism in Iraq. I analyze how they make use of historical terminology and the Islamic rhetoric, and to what end they proceed in such manners. I argue that various regimes in Iraq mobilize and securitize sectarian identities.
Thank you so much. So currently the research you're working on is titled Securitized Sectarian Differences in Post-2003 Iraq, Mobilization of the Religious Rhetoric by Political Leadership. So tell us more about what motivated your interest in this specific topic and the issues you're responding to. And are there any preliminary conclusions you would like to share?
So thank you very much for this really interesting questions. As you know, I'm from Iraq and I like to watch news like many other people. So in the media, they always frame this conflict, sectarian conflict, for example, in Iraq, as like religious conflicts. So when I studied in academia, I found that also there are some like scholars point to that. So sectarian conflict in the Muslim world is serious global threat to the world, according to many scholars. So because the sectarian conflict have spread in Iraq and in the Middle East in general. So Western Orientalists scholars have focused on the sectarian identities as a source of conflict. However, there are significant disagreement on how to examine the role of sectarian identities in the conflict. On one hand, a primordial approach presumes that ethnic and sectarian identities are natural and source of conflict. On the other hand, instrumentalists view sectarian identities as a tool used by political elites to manipulate audience. According to constructivism, which is now the major trend in the understanding of sectarianism, consider that sectarian identities could not be mobilized unless differences in beliefs and historical memory compelled religious groups into collective actions and around particularistic identities. So the project that I'm doing now, researching about, intends to investigate the case of sectarian conflict and the increase of violence as a securitization process that occurred in Iraq in the aftermath of the US invasion in 2003. The war of 2003 resulted in considerable changes in political and social life in Iraq. The new political elite comprised mostly Shia Muslim Islamists who lived in exile and returned to Iraq after the Saddam regime change. This article's primary goal is to explore the underlying mechanism of sectarianization at play in sectarian conflict. The crucial questions to ask here: how both Sunni and Shia leaders securitized sectarian identities in post-2003 Iraq, and how both utilized narrative in the Islamic and modern history to legitimize their sect-based violence. In this article also, I focus on the discourses and narrative of political leaders, political actors, and analyze how they identify and respond to threats. In doing so, I attempt to demonstrate how both Shia and Sunni political elites, when resorting to various forms of violence against each other, assassination, kidnapping, bombing, utilizing speeches that called for such actions during the Civil War 2006-2007. Furthermore, historical terminologies that the political leaders use against each other increase the tension between the sectarian groups. For instance, the Sunnis called the Shia Safawi, this term to then the Persians, and the Shia called the Sunnis Wahhabis, the term used to dissident Saudi Arabia. So I argue that those terms increase the tension between both Sunni and Shia. Many scholars and contemporary scholars have trying to find or understand the turning point, the main turning point in post-2003 Iraq and the Sunni-Shia relation. So some scholars point toward the Fallujah War, 2004. Some of them pointed to Najaf explosion, Ashura explosion. But I argue that the main turning point in post-2003 Iraq is the Najaf explosion, and when the Shia leaders, Muhammad Bakr al-Hakim, was assassinated in a car bomb. I believe this is the main turning point. When a Shia Islamist poet, Rahim al-Maliki, he decides to mourn his religious and political leader, Muhammad Bakr al-Hakim, in the form of that he mastered best a poem. In his poem, he described the enemies and he blames the Shia for these attacks against the Shia because they didn't take the opportunity to take a revenge or harsh measures against the enemies. In fact, he explained in his poetry, and my paper, I wrote the whole translation of the poem, and he explained the clothes of the enemy, the location. So of course, it was referring to Sunni population. And he mentioned that the Ba'this, the Wahhabis, and this, the Shia radical Islamist rhetoric shaped the Sunni-Shia relation, sectarian hatred, describing the enemies, as I mentioned, clothes and location, and regarding the Ba'thist and the Wahhabis as significant threat to the whole Shia population. And these discourses warn the Sunnis population that any form of violence that will befall them will be done by the Shia militias. So how can we understand the whole situation in contemporary Iraq? So securitization theory can help us to analyze political actors' securitized sectarian identities in post-2003 Iraq. And the securitization theory explains how political players transform a question that do not constitute any extensional threat to a state into a matter of national security and legitimize exceptional measures to deal with those threats. In the case of Iraq, political leaders and political players securitize the sectarian identities in order to gain political power. So securitization theory also helps us to explain the discourses of both Sunni and Shia in post-2003 Iraq. According to this theory, the securitizing actors make a security statement to protect a referent object in order by convincing their audience to consider an issue as a threat. Moreover, securitization theory emphasizes how sectarian rhetoric is produced and reproduced. Securitization theory also emphasizes on political actors' discourses. In my research, I emphasize on both political actors, high level, like political leaders, politicians, and lower levels, like poems or like journalists. So, however, I argue in my paper that we need to look beyond the political leaders' discourses. We should also consider religious images and banners displayed in the street, symbolically used to mobilize audience and securitization process of the sectarian divide in Iraq. For instance, I shared in my paper an example of this, the use of image and the securitization process. For example, in 2010, there was an Iranian TV show series talking about a political leader or a movement that appeared in the 7th century in Najaf, which is like in Iraq. The leader of that movement was Al-Mukhtar. So Al-Mukhtar, he was a character that took revenge from the people who killed Imam Hussein, the main character, the most important character in the Shia Islam that was killed in the Battle of Karbala. So he took revenge from them, but he was killed by the enemy of the Shia, and he was betrayed by his own companions, Shia. So al-Maliki, the former prime minister, during the election of 2010, used that picture. That picture was spread everywhere in the mostly Shia areas, says support the al-Mukhtar of modern al-Mukhtar. So that show us al-Maliki and his group used that character from the 7th century to make people, mobilize people and make them believe that al-Maliki, he's under threat of Sunni as well as some Shia that were against al-Maliki. So in this case, I shared pictures of that were displayed in the streets of Baghdad and other cities of Shia militias that they are fighting in Syria. They also securitize the sectarian conflict in Syria. In this case, imagery and symbols become more influential in the securitization process. Political leaders in post-2003 Iraq relied greatly on images and symbols in order to gain power. Political leaders in Iraq use those images in order to manipulate people, as the pictures you can see everywhere in Baghdad and in Iraq, and cannot be avoided. So, for example, the political discourses can be seen or can be heard through TV, through radio, but the images that they are everywhere, so they cannot be avoided. And these pictures, there is a saying that can say thousands of words. So when political leaders fail to provide prosperity to their people, they provide instead fear. So Shia political actors associate sectarianism with the Ba'athist regime, Wahhabism, Saudi Arabia, and IS through their discourses. In contrast, Sunni political actors relate sectarianism with Shia militias, Iran, foreign powers. Both accuse the others of being loyal to foreign powers and not to Iraqi nation. So the politicization and securitization of the sectarian divide cannot be explained only in domestic Iraq politics, but also in regional politics as well. As regional power struggle between Iran and Saudi Arabia has escalated, particularly after the fall of the Ba'athist regime in 2003. And we also witnesses many securitization discourses. For example, the Egyptian president, former president, Hosni Mubarak, when he, during his speeches, warned Arabs and the world from the Shia and Iran power. Same thing, King of Jordan. So both Shia and Sunni political elites seeking to legitimize their leadership and gain power work to securitize ethno-sectarian identities in post-2003 Iraq by utilizing rhetoric, speeches, narrative, images, tribal societies, historical memories, which has led to endless circle of assassination and violence and changes in the Iraqi society. Thank you.
Wow, that's very detailed. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And finally, what are your future plans in terms of research topics, publications, or any other academic activities?
Thank you very much. So previously I researched, in order to research about the understand the sectarian violence, what I mentioned, in my thesis, I also talked about, like, there are periods in the Iraqi contemporary history since 2003 till today. So there is rise of sectarian violence, there is sectarian violence period, and there is decline of sectarianism. So also there is securitization and desecuritization in Iraqi history. So how the end of this violence and like the sectarian violence happened in 2006, 2008, then from 2008, 2010 was decline in sectarianism and of course securitization discourses. So I tried to understand that, and I found that political actors in Iraq, Americans as well as Iraqis, relied on tribal societies. Of course, there was consequences. It stabilized the security, but there was also consequences. So this non-state actors help provide security to Iraq and stabilize the security. But at the same time, what I find that this policy have had tribalized the urban areas in Iraq. Usually, tribal societies are in the countryside, and in the urban area are more modernized. But after this policy, especially, it increased. Of course, in my research, I cannot talk about it now because it's too long. There is historical background about it, but there is something now. It's making me keep thinking about it, the relationship between those non-state actors. So in 2014, when IS came to Iraq, we witnessed the uh, decrease of sectarian discourses. And we found the unity among people of Iraq because there was a threat from outside, which is IS. So the state also relied on non-state actors, Shia militias, to fight IS, as well as, again, the tribal society. So for me, I try now to understand the relationship between militias, the Islamist militias, and the tribal society. Because I feel now the militias are stronger than the tribal societies. And also how that work, I try to examine this relationship and examine how the Shia militias securitize the uprising of 2019. There was uprising in Iraq in 2019, and the uprisers mostly were in the Shia areas, and tribal societies involved in it. So there was also a narrative from some political parties, from some Shia militias, that this uprising is a threat to the nation because associating this uprising with foreign power again, with the Ba'athist, America, Israel, Saudi Arabia. So this will never end. It continues. So I try to understand that. And this my research where I talked about it. I try to submit it also for publication for near future. And this what I talked about now, I think will be my next research. Thank you.
Thank you again for sharing your research with us, Haidar. We really appreciate the
Thank you.
conversation.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.